Thanks for being at this month's Institute for Public Policy and Social Research Public Policy Forum. Please continue to get something to eat. My name is Arnold Weinfeld. I'm Associate Director at MSU's IPPSR, and very pleased to have a nice crowd on hand today for what I think is not just an important topic, but also currently a hot topic among policymakers here at the Capitol. And I recognize many faces here, so I guess it must be important, which is good. Today's topic, of course, is economic development incentives, their use, their efficacy, and I think we've got a great panel of varying viewpoints and perspectives to talk about this issue. I'll introduce them, and then we'll have them come up one at a time. They'll give their presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I think it's important that you know who's with us today. Tim Bartik is a senior economist at the Upjohn Institute. His research focuses on how broad-based prosperity can be advanced through better local labor markets, local labor market policies. This includes both policies affecting labor demand, such as state and local economic development policies, and policies affecting labor supply. His recent work on economic development is research developing a database of economic development incentive programs around the U.S. Tim has been with Upjohn since 1989. He is a graduate of University of Wisconsin-Madison and Yale, and spent some time as an assistant professor of economics at Vanderbilt. James Hohman is the director of fiscal policy for the Mackinac Center. He holds a degree in economics from Northwood University in Midland, and has been with Mackinac Center for over 20 years. An expert on fiscal policy issues, including state and local pension systems, he is also opined quite frequently on the way state government offers incentives to handpicked corporations. And finally, we have Bob Tresize. Bob sends up to lunch right now. And Bob is president and CEO of the Lansing Area Economic Partnership. And he's been in that position since 2011. LEAP represents the Lansing, Michigan region, which includes Clinton, Eaton, and Ingham counties. During his tenure with LEAP, the Tri-County Lansing regional economy has welcomed private sector investment projects totaling over $3 billion. Along with more than 6,400 direct private jobs. LEAP and Bob have been recognized nationally and internationally by various economic development organizations. Before his time at LEAP, Bob was managing director of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation's Community Assistance Team. He's also the founder of the Michigan Main Street Program and has been vice president of the Lansing Regional Chamber of Commerce, and was also director here locally of Delta Township's Economic Development Department. So those are our three speakers, and we're going to start with Tim.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. As Arnold mentioned, this is very opportune because there is currently pending legislation in the states considering that would make major changes to the state's economic development incentives. And without getting too much into the weeds of legislation, there are proposals, one, to take some funds that currently are devoted to incentives for large projects, to take some of those funds, not all of them, and devote those to public transit and various community development services. So that's one proposal. Let's divert some incentive funds to some other programs, some services. And then the other proposal, there are lots of proposals to actually expand economic development incentives, including reviving a payroll tax credit program that the state used to have. So what I'm going to do today is first, I'm going to make some comments on this pending legislation and what I think of it. But to set the context for that, I'm going to first discuss what economics research says about what are economic development policies that will have a high benefit cost ratio. How can we maximize benefits and minimize costs? And to summarize at the outset, I'm going to be making 3 points about the research, which I'll come back and elaborate on these. Point one is The benefits of economic development programs mainly depend on how they affect the employment to population ratio, which I'll call the employment rate. Second, and there are things we can do to increase that in how we design these policies. The second point is that if we want to reduce cost per job created, the cost per job created of through various business services is lower than that for cash incentives, either business tax incentives or cash grants. On the other hand, it is obviously easier to hand out cash than it is to manage various types of business services. That has both advantages and disadvantages. And finally, if we want to increase the benefits of these programs, we need to recognize that there are synergies, and comprehensive programs are better, and programs that are customized to local economies are likely to be more effective than simply doing single program or single projects. Okay, so the first point. We want to increase the employment population ratio. And the thing to realize there, if you think about it logically, when we bring jobs to an area, we increase employment, it has to either increase the employment to population ratio or the population. I mean, it has to, some combination of that. And the research actually shows that in the average local labor market, when we create jobs, only 15% of those increase the employment rate. The other 85% increase the population through spurring in migration. Now you might say, okay, Dr. Bartik, how on earth is that possible? Surely local hiring is higher than 15%. Well, yeah, it is. When a new firm comes to an area and creates jobs, those hires come from three sources. You hire some people who already were employed in the local residents. You hire some local residents who were unemployed, and you hire some in-migrants. But if a job is filled by hiring someone who's already employed, that creates a job vacancy. Those job vacancies are filled in the same three ways. Hiring people already employed, hiring unemployed, hiring in-migrants. And ultimately, this job vacancy chain is only terminated when all new jobs are reflected in either a higher employment rate or a higher in-migration rate. And it depends on who's hired along that way. Companies are making decisions all the time. Do I hire someone who's unemployed in the local economy, or hire someone who's moving in, or what do I do? And so that's important. It's not as high as you think. It's not the case that every job pushes up the local employment rate. Now, the social and fiscal benefits of new jobs are much higher if they increase the employment rate. Boosting the employment rate directly boosts earnings per capita. More people have jobs. It pushes upward pressure on the wage rate, so earnings go up for that reason as well. So that's one social benefit, but it has spillover benefits. Substance abuse is lower, crime is lower, family breakups are lower. So it strengthens the community in many ways. There will also be much higher fiscal benefits. Tax revenue tends to increase with earnings per capita, not surprisingly. When earnings go up and employment goes up, that tends to increase tax revenue. On the other hand, service demands, public service demands and needs tend to go up with the population. More people come in, you need to hire more teachers, more police, expand your roads, things like that. So increasing the employment population ratio is key to having more fiscal benefits. Now, there are things you can do to affect how many jobs go to the non-employed versus in-migrants. For example, as I mentioned, it varies with in the average local labor market, 15% of the new jobs go to the non-employed, 85% in-migrants. But if the local labor market is distressed, by which I mean at baseline it has more people who are unemployed, then almost about 1/3 of the jobs go to the non-employed. Why? Because there are more of them available to be hired. On the other hand, if an area is booming, that is, that the economy is already so hot that almost anyone who's employable is employed, then almost all the jobs end up going to in-migrants. And so in a booming local labor market, only 4 out of 100 new jobs will actually boost the local non-employment rate. Now, in the Michigan context for this, to visualize this, So a place that's booming might be Grand Rapids or Traverse City. And really, jobs in those areas pretty much will just boost, other things equal, will pretty much just boost in-migration. Places like Flint might be in the distress category, as would a lot of rural Michigan, a lot of the UP, many rural counties in Michigan. Somewhere like Lansing might be in the middle. So this affects the benefit-cost ratio. So it would be the case that helping out Lansing, which Bob would be nice to hear, probably has about 3 times the benefit of providing jobs at Grand Rapids. On the other hand, providing jobs in Flint would be about twice as good in terms of the benefit-cost ratio. So we need to think about targeting distressed places because it makes a dramatic difference to the social and fiscal benefits that accrue to the state. We also can affect things by affecting who firms hire along these job vacancy chains. And we can do this by targeting various types of what I'll call job access services at the non-employed. So job access service includes obvious things like public transit, but it also could include getting people reliable used cars. It could include childcare. People can't work unless they have childcare. It includes lots of workforce development services. It includes job information, job training for jobs. It includes job retention services to help people keep jobs, etc. Now, if you're providing those kind of services, if you really want to help the non-employed in a huge way, if you target this on distressed neighborhoods, this will pay off the most, because that's where the non-employed are. They're in distressed neighborhoods with high non-employment rates, and we have many of them in Michigan in every city and also in every rural area. There are areas that have much higher non-employment rates. And if you can provide these kind of services in these areas and help people access jobs, that can make a difference to whether the non-employed get jobs. Okay, so point 1 I finished. Point 2 is cost per job. How do we lower cost per job? Now, business tax incentives do affect business location decision, but the true cost per job is higher than you might think because not every incented firm was actually induced to create the job due to the incentive. Many of the firms would have done the same thing without the incentive, or in some cases, we might have had some other firm that would have occupied the same site and created the same number of jobs. So when you account for that, the net cost per job created has a present value, when you add up the incentives over all the years, of about $200,000 per job. Now that's a lot of money. I should mention, though, that certainly in distressed areas and even in average areas, the benefits of a new job in terms of increasing employment rates and earnings for many years can easily exceed $500,000. So even spending $200,000 to get a job might pay off. On the other hand, a booming area, maybe not. Maybe you don't really want to provide cash incentives in a really booming area. But you can get a lot cheaper if you do infrastructure. So what I mean by infrastructure, that would include things like site development, making sure you have the right utilities on the site, making sure you have access roads, et cetera, et cetera. That has a much lower cost per job created, as does so-called customized job training, where community colleges will train workers to a firm-specific skill needs. Also, business advice program, which includes things like manufacturing extension services, works with small and medium-sized manufacturers, help them expand their markets, adopt new technology, or small business development centers that work with entrepreneurs or small business to help them be more successful. Now, why are these things cheaper? Because they're providing services that businesses have trouble fully providing on their own. So, infrastructure, the business is not in a position to on its own provide that. It's a public service. So, now as I mentioned, though, on the other hand, business tax incentives should expand. No one is claiming that the bridge to nowhere, that's infrastructure. A bridge to nowhere does not create jobs. So you need to design these programs well. No one's claiming that a lousy customized job training program or a poorly run small business development center will create jobs. They have to be well run. So there is the challenge of making sure you manage these programs so they deliver high quality services. Third point, having comprehensive and customized services is more effective than doing single projects or programs. So what I mean by that is, firms have many reasons they might locate or expand in an area. And if you provide both, say, infrastructure and workforce development, that's likely to be more effective than just doing one of those things. Similarly, if you want to boost employment rates, working on the labor demand side and the labor supply side together, so working both on creating jobs and working on increasing job access is likely to be have some synergistic effects. And the reality is what kind of mix of services is needed is going to vary across Michigan enormously. So we talk about the Michigan economy, but okay, there is no Michigan economy. The Michigan economy is a fiction. There are local economies. There's a Lansing economy. There's a Flint economy. There's a Grand Rapids area economy. There's a Detroit area economy. There's economies in different rural counties, Eastern UP, Central UP, Western UP. There is no Michigan economy. So each of those areas have different strengths and weaknesses. Some areas might be short of business sites. There we need to do things in site development, making sure that sites are available for business and have the right infrastructure so that businesses can locate the right zoning, et cetera, et cetera. Some places may have serious workforce development issues. Some places may have inadequate child care, meeting labor supply, right? Some areas public transit may be the greatest thing since sliced bread. Other areas, maybe that's not really feasible. Maybe you need to give people reliable used cars. So you go on and on and on. You need to have flexible services of a variety of the nature if you really want to turn a local economy around. Okay, so let me come back. I promised you I'd make at least some comment on existing legislation. As I said, one proposal is let's take some money away from our incentives for large projects and devote it to public transit and various community development services. What do I think of that? Should the state do that? I would say yes, but, and I'll explain the but in a minute. Should the state expand its economic development budget, as is being proposed? Various incentive programs might be added, and they cost the state money, even if they're supposedly just foregoing taxes. They cost the state money. Should the state do that? I would say maybe. So let me explain those caveats. I would say that if the state wants to expand its economic development budget, it should target distressed local labor markets and neighborhoods. I don't think there's any point in the state expanding its economic development budget if all that's going to do is support projects in the most booming areas of the state. I think that makes sense. That's the maybe. We should expand if we can figure out how to do geographic targeting better. And then the other issue is, should we devote funding to services? Well, we should consider doing that. But I would say that although I have nothing against public transit or community development services, I think we need more comprehensive approaches to give each local area the services it needs to succeed. And in some cases, maybe public transit is the key for many areas. Other areas it may not be. So I think we need to recognize our diverse local economies and provide them the kind of services that will really turn their economy around. Thank you.
Tim, appreciate that. And next up, James Hohman from the Mackinac Center.
Hi. First, I can't quite hear the speakers. Can everyone hear all right? George, good? Good. All right. So I'm James Hohman. I'm the Director of Fiscal Policy at the Mackinac Center. If you haven't heard about the Mackinac Center yet, we are a research and advocacy group that's focused on Michigan. And we rely on the support of thousands of people across the state. And so if my message resonates with you today, I hope you check us out online and consider giving us a donation. And my message today is pretty simple. Economic development programs are not about economic development. They are about political development. They provide important political benefits, and they are the result of political calculus. And this should not be a surprise to anyone in the room that the programs our lawmakers pass go through a political process and serve political ends. And what are those ends? Well, they're a really important one. To show that you're doing something about jobs. This is something that elected officials at all levels feel like they need to, and they need to, they feel like this provides important benefits for an important reason, is that it's popular. People want to live in a growing and thriving place, and they want our lawmakers to do something about jobs. And what they ask our lawmakers to do doesn't come with a specific policy proposal, so anything tying lawmakers to jobs serves an important political benefit. But more important than that is our selective favoritism programs, because that's what our economic development policies are. They give some businesses favors or benefits, tax advantages, credits, or direct cash subsidies to some but not other businesses. And let me tell you some of the benefits that our lawmakers get. They get to say great things about how this is driving growth. And I've actually assembled some of the quotes from our lawmakers that I've used over the past couple of years. Michigan is on the precipice of a modern industrial revolution. The actions taken today will set the stage for our grandchildren's futures. Our state will be able to win huge transformational projects and compete effectively for every dollar and every job for decades to come. The investment we make today has generational impact, and generations of Michiganders will thrive because of this investment. The news about this project signals a new day of prosperity for the Upper Peninsula. And of course, the most famous one, in 5 years, you're going to be blown away. Now, I bring up these quotes because while they're saying how great all of these programs are doing, Michigan is falling behind. Our state population has been stuck at around 10 million people since 2000. We're one of the few states that has fewer jobs now than we did in 2000. We've lost out on a generation's worth of job growth. But the ability to offer some companies select favors allows our lawmakers to pretend that they're doing something to change that trend. Now, I say pretend here carefully, because our economic development programs are not the result of our lawmakers looking at the academic literature about what works for business subsidies. They're not trying to develop programs to drive prosperity in the places that are lagging behind. What they're doing instead is pretty simple. Businesses and business lobbies approach our lawmakers and ask for special favors, and our lawmakers say yes. And they say yes for simple reasons based on political calculus. But what businesses ask for is also the result of political calculus. And that has changed a lot over time. So in the 70s, basically the only selective favor that the state of Michigan offered were property tax abatements that allowed some industries, and mostly factories, manufacturers, to pay less in property taxes than they otherwise would, and it was given to a handful of companies. Of course, in the 80s, there was another thing. I was looking at the history of this, is that most of the state's economic development budget was geared towards export assistance. I actually had a friend at a think tank in North Carolina who cut his teeth on doing export assistance in North Carolina. He said it was his job to help grocery stores around the world stock Texas Pete. I said, Joe, why are you selling Texas Pete for North Carolina? And it turns out I didn't know this. Texas Pete's a liar. I mean, Texas Pete is a Louisiana hot sauce made in North Carolina by a guy named Sam. But I digress. So that was in the 80s. We did tax abatements. We did some export assistance, and there were some other things. Every governor's dabbled in this issue, but we didn't write hundreds of millions of dollars of checks to select companies. Of course, we started doing that kind of subtly through the Michigan Economic Growth Authority, started in 1995, where businesses received refundable tax credit programs that had nothing to do with how much these businesses owed in taxes. So they essentially received a check. And I know this because right now, those companies receive hundreds of millions of dollars more in tax credits than they owe in tax liabilities. We use our business tax code to take money, instead of raising money for government services, but instead to redistribute money from taxpayers to select companies. And of course, with the SOAR program now, we're just writing hundreds of millions of dollars, we're writing $100 million checks to select companies. Now, we're doing this in response to business demands, and there's political calculus for it. But one thing that is unfortunate, and one thing I would love to see changed about the state's economic development programs, is some type of effect, some type of expectation that they're going to do something to improve Michigan economic outcomes. I mean, it sounds like they are. You read the quotes. You see the names for the programs that our lawmakers have created. So you've got the Transformational Brownfield program. It's not required to transform anything. You've got the Michigan Business Development Program. It's not required to develop businesses. It hands out money to select businesses, and the deals are not even required or expected to make the business do anything that they wouldn't have done already. Of course, the proposed high-wage incentive program for regional employment is not required to increase wages or employment. It would be easy to put in economic outcomes and expectations into these programs so that if they don't produce the desired effect on growth, if they don't do the thing that our lawmakers say that they're going to do with these programs, that our lawmakers reevaluate them, that they are accountable to the state's economic outcome, and they reassess if what they think is going to improve the economy doesn't work. Because I think there are some things that would help improve the state's economy. We write about them all the time. We've got improvements for tax policy. We've got improvements in occupational licensing rules, in the regulation of our incumbent utilities to ensure cheaper and more reliable electricity. And you guys can check this all out on our site. But what you should notice is that our economic development programs are not required to develop the economy. And this is something that's not just me and my friends at the Mackinac Center saying. There's actually a cross-ideological group of people who've kind of noticed that we shouldn't try to compete in the race for jobs when it involves who can offer the most selective assistance to footloose companies. In fact, this is something that I really like about this policy area, because you get support on both the right and the left. And they get support for the exact same reason. We don't think it's the appropriate business of government to write $100 million checks to select companies. What we should care about are basic business climate issues, quality of life issues, the basic structure of our government, and try to have effective ways to improve the economy. So thank you for that, and I hope we get some good questions. Thank you.
Next is Bob Tresize, President and CEO of the Lansing Economic Area Partnership.
Thanks, Arnold. Hi, everybody. I just want to thank both of our colleagues, my colleagues today. Thank you very much for the very interesting comments. And Arnold, thank you to the Institute for the invitation today. I also want to thank the Michigan Economic Developers Association for inviting me to represent the economic development profession today. So Megan, thank you very much for that honor. And if I could just say, I'm truly a Lansing kid. Cumberland, Otto, Sexton. I grew up in the city of Lansing, MSU, and that whole story. I mean, this is my truly hometown. We're fighting for our hometown. Their job really matters to me on a personal basis, if I could say. And with that, I wanted to start out with a couple comments about the profession itself. I know that because it is a profession, there's politics certainly involved as there is in everything, but it is a profession as well, filled with amazing professionals who are fighting for their hometowns every day. Someone like me and some other people out here that I see in the audience. And the profession, I get it, is very, I suppose, in the public eye, well known for helping big business and big money and big developers and sort of all that. But I just want to suggest to you that the economic development profession was actually set up and exists on behalf of trying to make your community more prosperous and all people within that community prosperous. Every time I work with incentives, and it has been all of them that you probably don't enjoy all that much times 100, my profession, my agency is thinking about how they have benefited the community. Tim made a lot of interesting references to this as well. That's what we think about. How are we really impacting people? You know, why are we doing this job? And it is because of partnership. I believe that the miracle of the United States has essentially been based on a history of partnerships between public and private sector. And I would suggest to you that that is maybe a somewhat different way to look at as incentives as well. And of course, what we're dealing with in the trenches, on the ground, not at a policy level, economic development, economic developers as a profession is utterly apolitical, is we are dealing with just the realities of fierce competition. Agree or disagree, but all the other countries and all the other states are doing it in really mostly over the last 20 years, a far more consistent and mostly in a much bigger way than the state of Michigan. So we got to get down there and fight. And we're fighting with the CEO, and he or her has to, at the end of the day, from a fiduciary standpoint, has to justify the decision between a site here and a site there based on how much it's going to cost that business on a site. They have a responsibility to their shareholders and beyond to make that kind of presentation, and that's where we get typically at the finish line, so that they take one step over that finish line for us and not for the other site. But just a quick story along those lines about competition. I happened to be down, spent a couple days in Benton Harbor, San Joe area last week, and because I'm lame or something like that, but I was in my hotel room that night at 11 o'clock, and I watched the local news, which I guess no one, sorry TV 10, fewer people do that, except for TV 10. But you know, it turns out you're right on the border and you feel like you're in Indiana. And I was watching South Bend's local television. Their first 3 stories on their 11 o'clock news were major stories, all rah-rah about their economic development efforts, and their big breaking news of the night was that Microsoft, they said, Microsoft had selected a 900-acre site right across the border for $11 billion IA data center. Microsoft data center. And, you know, I mean, I don't know any facts about it. I don't know why here versus there and all of that, except to tell you it's being announced there and not here. And I know the guy really well who runs Cornerstone Alliance down there. He resigned last night, not because of this project, but a lot of other things. But he's going to a big job in Louisiana. And I don't know, that whole story has really resonated with me. You know, to live down there in a border, it's a little bit safer up here in Lansing or somewhere else, but to live in that border with that immediate competition right in front of you, I do know that my great friend Rob down there who ran Cornerstone, that it drove him insane day in and day out to watch what Indiana was able to do with incentives versus what we were able to do. And there's a lot more to Indiana versus Michigan too, I acknowledge, with a lot of different policies and different things, so for sure. But I just think a key word in economic development, if I could suggest to everybody, is the word discern, which seems to be more and more of a relic of a word in all of our discourse. But I mean, the fact is, if I could just be real again, from down in the trenches, what I see every day, to let you know what it's like, is that maybe a debate could and should be held about the efficacy, the need, the proper use of incentives in perhaps some other states. And, you know, that have a lot of sunshine, that have warm weather year around, that have oceans and mountains. And I mean, it's real. That is the kind of thing that we face. Intangible qualities like that are very difficult for us to overcome. And here in Michigan, we're a peninsula. And people don't talk about it a lot, but we're not on the main dragway through Ohio and Indiana. We're not in the way. You have to come up intentionally to come up here. It's a very real issue. We don't hardly ever talk about it, but it is can be a disadvantage. No one wants to talk about this, but we are incredibly cloudy. And I know, oh gosh, is this really where Bob is going with this? But it is a very real issue, clouds and cold. It really is. We have unique legacy reputations about us that are still very, very difficult to overcome, that most other states seemingly don't have. Of course, we have a shrinking population, a shrinking economy, and if you compare it in real numbers, you know, to the late 70s even, and a shrinking revenue pie, which is the real problem. We need more business and more people living here. And then the lack of consistency by the state of Michigan the last 20 years has been remarkable, and definitely I can tell you directly from site consultants and businesses is a real standout. Is that Michigan 6-7 years ago had 3 years of the good jobs for Michigan, and then for 3 years we don't. And now we're trying to resurrect it with a little bit of a different take on it, different name called hinder. You know, and there's a big debate about that. We had the SOAR legislation in place for what, 2 years, maybe? 2 years. And I'm a big fan of SOAR because that is why here in Lansing, the Ultium electric car battery plant is 3/4 done under construction right now. 2,000 people have been working on that for 2.5 years and are making a great living for their families for a quite extended time. It'll eventually employ 1,700 people. It's $2.5 billion of investment. But more importantly than all that, and of course it had a huge incentive from the SOAR. That plant and those people and those jobs are there and not in a border state because of that SOAR legislation. It's flat out, that is an absolute fact that I absolutely know. So one difference between some of our approaches is that maybe a project would have happened anyways. And we try to be as careful as we can. We try to analyze that. Of course, most of my argument is that they wouldn't be here because we have a lot, just to be frank amongst friends in this room, we have a lot that we have to overcome before we even begin to compete. That's just the reality with the southern states, with the east and west coasts. That is something that I have to deal with. I went to North Carolina's website yesterday in preparation for this, and you know, banged my head against the wall for a while. Number one is why in North Carolina, and of course they have a sun and warm and ocean and all of that. And then their media, so they have all that going for them already, over us, to be frank about it, over us. But then their very next button on their website is incentives. So not only do those states that have huge, sort of these intangible, enormous qualities that people in business really seek, but on top of that, they then have the incentives. They then have the incentives. The next button was sites. Click on it, mega sites. Oh, that's interesting because I've kind of gone through hell in life with regard to some mega sites myself, as many others have in the state of Michigan the last year. And oh yeah, North Carolina, no problem. Look at it yourself. A long list of mega sites, 4,000 acres, 2,000 acres, property graded, utilities on site, a bunch of choices. In fact, it says you can only develop a minimum of 50 acres within these mega sites. One reason why there's been so much difficulty with the mega sites in Michigan is because for the last 20 years, again, we did not have consistent economic development policy. Those other states were meticulously planning, preparing, working with the community, engaged with the community, and putting together massive sites for 20 years. And they had to have the patience of that kind of investment. Here we didn't do that, like we haven't done with a lot of other incentives, and then suddenly we had a reshoring of massive chip makers and EV makers. We had to make a move super, super fast, not proper engagement with communities or preparation or anything like that. It was a shock, and of course you have the result of a shock, which is people are upset, and it's a really difficult situation. So that is just another cost, if you will, of not having regular, consistent economic development sites. So just quickly as I conclude here about the cost of incentives, I know, I get it. I've seen it my entire 30-year career, and we'll probably be talking about 30 years from now, is the dreaded math equation of a job divided by the cost of that. Jim talked about it at $212,000. And just some additional thoughts about that. Again, as I've mentioned earlier, I really think a part of the premise is that something would have gone there anyway, in part, I think is part of the argument. Whereas me, no. And I think it does depend. I was really interested, Tim, in the different communities, and we're all different, and it could be a case by case. With regard to property taxes, if I could say, they were all industrial businesses. John, I think 10 years ago or so, where property tax for industrial businesses was eliminated. And before that, we would pick certain companies based on that they were going to create X amount of jobs and X amount of investment. And I think from a financial, fiscal perspective, that may have been, our way may have been a smarter approach overall, but I realize that's debatable. But we are part of that cost, Tim, sometimes, or at least what I hear frequently from CEOs, is they literally, like you did, they will lay a piece on the paper and say the EV plant with 2,000 jobs could be, I'm making this up, in Italy or Singapore, or I don't know, something like that, and versus you. Or they lay it on there and say South Carolina versus you. And they definitely show through a calculation a gap of how much it costs in Michigan, or really I think it's more fair to say the United States, versus somewhere else. I mean, it's real. And again, with the fiduciary responsibility, that CEO has to make a decision based on the financial well-being of their shareholder. I mean, what makes more sense? And again, just a little bit of a reality check. I also think, and of course, clever of me because you can't really measure this at all, but what is the cost of not doing it? I mean, did it, you know, that Microsoft plant apparently is going to be made there. Could the Altium plant here in Lansing, could someone possibly say that we would be better off without it? Maybe it would be another location for a business at some point. You never know that at all. But it's very, what is the cost of not doing it? I also would say part of the value of incentives is sheer, I think so much of an economy is purely psychological. In Tennessee, Nashville, I mean, you get this moment, Texas, you get this momentum going of landing. Go to North Carolina's website. I just, for half an hour, put my head down. I mean, they're number 1, number 3, number 5, over and over in this industry and that industry. And, you know, again, I acknowledge there are lots of reasons for that. But they put incentives to in their list. But you get this momentum. You get this psychological value to incentives. You land this big company, that big company. It makes it far easier that 10 and 20 and 30 more companies are going to come along with that. I would also say that especially with manufacturing, that the multiplier effect, suppliers and so forth, is really profound, and we have to think about that. If that Altium plant, those 1,700 people that will be working here at quite good wages actually, because as they compete and actually deal with the reality of hiring employees, they realize what they actually have to pay, maybe more than what they reported initially. And those are at the top of the pyramid, those huge kind of businesses with those kind of huge number of jobs are what really sustain small businesses, Main Street businesses, restaurants that need those customers. They fill places of worship. They fill our elementary schools that have been closed in our backyards. They're philanthropic giving. I mean, that is who those people are, and I wonder whether a value, and then finally, I promise you, I really do promise, Arnold, but, you know, TIFs, I always wonder whether, I don't know, Tim, whether TIFs are part of a calculation when the old math about the jobs. And I'm in love with TIFs. I'll tell you that right now. They are self-regulating. They are not money. I don't know how often I've heard someone say that, well, if we didn't do the TIF, so I did the power station over here. It used to have a coal stack next to it and a smokestack on top of it. Now it's filled with 800 people in a national headquarters. We preserve that building, clean the environment, river trail, everything, all that kind of stuff. But that's a renaissance zone for 15 years and then a brownfield TIF for 15 years. And I just think it had, its overall impact has had, you know, a truly huge value. Now, you could say, and I'm totally making up this math, is if the TIF on that project is, let's just say 30 million, you know, whatever it is, that someone might be tempted to say, well, that we could have taken that 30 million and spent it on schools or public infrastructure or the police or something. Except in TIFs, that isn't how it works. And I'm amazed at how many people don't understand that. There is no money. If there wasn't the TIF, the project wouldn't be there, the building would have been turned down, accident fund would have been somewhere else, who knows, they're a national company. And there would be no money. There is no money. It's either a TIF and the project is a result of the TIF. If there wasn't a TIF, there isn't a project. There is no, there would be no money to give. There is no money. So I just, I really enjoy this conversation if you can. I know I cheated on my time a little bit there, Arnold, but thank you and I look forward to questions.
Bob and James and Tim, you know, this is the essence of public policy right here, right? I mean, we've got different viewpoints, different perspectives, and it's important that you as an audience and your own professions and your work for some of you here at the state capitol and certainly policymakers to understand and work through those perspectives. A couple of personal anecdotes and then I have a couple of questions and then we'll get to questions from the audience. Bob, you talked about the psychological factor. And you know, I've certainly learned over the course of time that we here in Michigan are our own worst enemy. We talk ourselves down all the time. It's well known. I mean, Bob just did it, shook his head at North Carolina. And I'm not saying that those states don't have something to offer, but we've got things to offer too. Are we out of the way? Yeah, we're not on I-80. You're right, you purposely gotta want to come here. But you know, there's going to be water crises across this country over the next decade or two. Whether or not you believe Michigan's going to be a climate refuge state is another thing. But a lot of these production facilities need lots of water. We have it. We're starting to do better about our natural assets that we have here in the state. It is a four-season state. And yes, the cold is an issue, although I would say to those in North Carolina, if you live on the coast, I hope you have insurance. Oh wait, they no longer cover for hurricanes anymore. So, you know, each state has its pluses and minuses when it comes to that. But I do believe that we here in Michigan are sometimes too humble and too down on ourselves, and we've got to do better about talking that the assets we have and the things that we have to contribute here. So James, I have a question for you. You mentioned that the academic literature talks differently about what's best for economic development. Can you, I know it's a lot, but off the top of your head, talk a little bit about that literature?
Okay, so I think the thing to take away is that there have been decades worth of assessments from economists who use clever methods to isolate the economic effects of business subsidy programs. And my job would be easier if they said that they never work. But they do, some of the time. And I think a lot of them say that they don't produce more economic benefits than their costs. But none of them ever say that they produce large effects. Again, like our lawmakers say that they're creating a new industrial revolution when they write big checks to big companies. And that's just not supported by any of the actual assessments of their claims. And I think that's important because the scope and the context matters. Is that when you look at job growth and job loss in the state of Michigan, we create and lose over 800,000 jobs every single year. That is, most job providers are not asking for favors, and they're not asking for favors to add jobs, and they're not asking for permission to cut jobs. The things that matter are structural, and I think that's what we ought to be focused on, because that's what's going to have an influence over these things that we want. We want the state to be more prosperous, and the structural reforms are the way to do it.
So is there a state out there that you think we should be emulating?
Okay, so that's interesting, because we can look at states that are growing and that aren't growing. The fastest growing states in the country right now are Utah and Idaho, and they're not growing because they're writing the biggest checks to the biggest companies. In fact, I looked at Site Selection's review of all the big deals that get made in the country and stacked up. All right, here they are on a state-by-state basis. Let's see if landing big projects lead to economic growth, and they just don't. And now that's not to say that landing big projects, these headlines, produce or hurt your economy, but there's just no connection between landing these big companies and states adding jobs.
So there I would agree with you, Bob. Those two states certainly have different assets than we do geographically. Tim, your work has been in taking a look at incentives that states provide across the country. How does Michigan compare in terms of what it provides and how successful it might be with its incentive program?
Michigan is above average, but certainly isn't the highest state. New York State would be considerably higher, as would New Mexico, for example. Off the top of my head, I don't recall the exact ranking of all the states. Maybe I should have this memorized, but I have a publication you can read that ranks all the states and looks at how incentives have grown since 1990 and breaks it down state by state.
Thank you. All right, thank you again to these three. Tony, I think you've got the traveler mic, so to speak. Do we have questions from people in the audience? And of course, Tony, the first question is all the way up here. Hang on, we'll be with you in a second. We would appreciate you using the microphone so others can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. I was wondering if any of you might want to share thoughts on some of the less obvious economic components of our economies in Michigan. By which I mean there's an obvious reason that we're not trying to compete as far as wages go with Central African countries, right? We could abolish Michigan's minimum. Get in trouble with the feds, try to have a $7.25 minimum wage. I was wondering if you could speak to some of those kind of more human qualities in the ways that you assess economic development, whether that is just merely you want residents of Michigan or hypothetical communities to have simply the highest wage, the most reliable jobs, or if there's other aspects of quality of life that you measure when you look at economic development.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a really critical one. By the way, 2 years ago, I did lose a really important company through big incentives offered by Idaho. So I just wanted to note that. But with regard to your question overall, LEAP a year ago was created the region's first ever regional child care coalition. So we think child care, public transit, here in the Lansing region, we've gotten way better, but it's really frustrating that jobs exist on the other side of a yellow line down a road that happens to be a county border, and yet people, especially frankly persons of color, are over here, and that we can't connect them because of rules and regulations. I suppose that's something John would want to help us, James, excuse me, would want us to help us remove, and I would agree with you on that. Housing, obviously, not only attainable housing, but I would make an argument for all kinds of housing. What about the old-fashioned $120,000, $130,000, neighborhoods that used to be built for startup homes, if you will, for those young families? So I think we are big proponents of the SOAR legislation, as well as higher R&D tax credits, an innovation fund. We feel very strongly about that all these tools need to be put together, but we have been careful to advocate strongly for community benefit along with those, especially the bigger projects that have community impact, housing, public transit, childcare. It all has to work together for sure.
I guess what I would add is, the key thing I'm pushing, maybe this is just me as an economist, there's a budget constraint. You can't provide huge incentives to every single company that might want them. So you have to target. And for example, you would want to target companies that have a high jobs multiplier. You would want to target companies that hopefully, what I would describe as pay a wage premium. By that, where you need to take the wage and compare it with what say the educational credentials of the workers that company hires. I mean, a company can pay $150,000 a year, but if they're hiring all people who are PhD software engineers, that high wage job is not paying a premium relative to the credentials. But we know that different companies some companies pay a premium, and we want to target those. So the key thing I would want to focus on is, look, there's a budget constraint. You need to have a budget constraint on incentives. You need to recognize the trade-offs that, we need infrastructure, we need sites, we need to have childcare, we need to spend money on that. So we need to have a budget constraint, and therefore we need to target our things both on the right companies and, as I was mentioning, on distressed places, because there the payoff is higher.
Any other questions?
But James?
Right, let's just stay right here, and then we'll go back to...
I think Bob knows me. I entered the profession in 1973, and one of the early programs was the Industrial Facilities Exemption Act. Chrysler had a very old factory in downtown Detroit, and it wanted to renovate the facility, but didn't want to incur the tax burden that would come from a higher appraisal on that property. So what happened was that Governor Milliken and the whole team put together an industrial tax abatement program in which the assessment was frozen for 12 years, and Chrysler could go ahead and improve the property. This was providing assistance to a company to expand. And the analogy I have with use of economic development, on one hand, it's like inviting the girl of your dreams to go to the prom. What do? You take a bath, you clean up the car, you do those kinds of things. The other approach is, honey, I'll give you $100 to go to the prom with me. Well, I opt for option one, and I'll leave it there.
That's good. Yeah, let's go to the gentleman, to George, and then we'll go to Gene.
Where am I at?
George, raise your hand, George. Thank you.
Yeah, the first thing, thanks for being here. First thing is, government doesn't have any money. It only gets the money by taking it from somebody else. It takes that money from businesses in taxes, it takes that money from individuals in taxes. Those people, that money is being used to subsidize some business in this economic development thing. How do the businesses who are paying higher taxes to subsidize other businesses, you know, that doesn't seem very reasonable. Individuals are paying higher taxes to subsidize some businesses. It seems to me that when you come to allocating capital, it ought to be based on the prospects for that business, and the business ought to pay all the expenses associated with creating products and services, rather than being subsidized by some other taxpayer. Comments on that?
Oh, yeah, I agree. Well, so actually, let me, George, I want to bring up just another important thing, is that what we're talking about here is something that is a very, very old conversation in American government. It used to be, by judicial doctrine and by constitutional provision, that states were not allowed to subsidize private enterprise. This is in fact a judicial doctrine established here in Michigan by Justice Thomas Cooley, where he said that all private enterprise is beneficial, but it is not the business of government to provide selective favors. It is its job to provide equal laws and the benefit to all of equal laws. I paraphrase that, I screwed it up. You can check it out on our website for that one, for the direct quote. And it was this because states went bankrupt in the 1800s subsidizing canals and railroads. There was a lot of scam, a lot of theft, and states at this point didn't have a lot of taxation, and some struggled with insolvency for years. And this is actually one of the reasons why the 19th century America, at least the later half, was known as being this haven for free enterprise. It was not because of anything the federal government was doing. They were arguing about bimetallism unsuccessfully for like 60 years. But it was rather through this bottom-up effort led to the states to ensure this important principle of government, which is that the government exists for the public's benefit, and that it shouldn't be used to benefit someone's private interests. And that was a judicial doctrine. It's still an important one that is in place in some places, and I've got some friends who are trying to breathe life back into that. But that was the main reason why, when you go back to the 80s, we weren't writing $100 million checks to select companies, because it wasn't politically feasible, because that principle that people had that that's not the business of government was stronger. And I'd like to see us return to that, so that we're not competing with other states over who can write the biggest checks. Any other?
Well, I guess what I would comment is, you know, I'm an economist, so I'm naturally going to think that it's good to have the market work where it works. The issue in economic development is that labor markets are not pure private markets that perfectly clear and everyone gets a job who wants it, and the marginal worker you hire is indifferent because that's the value of their leisure time. In fact, there are huge spillover benefits of creating jobs. The workers who get the jobs are better off. The value of the job is greater than the foregoing leisure time. So the worker's better off. Their family's better off. The community's better off because of lower crime, lower substance abuse, et cetera, et cetera. So there are the huge spillover benefits. So from a technical standpoint, there's a huge market failure here. That we do not have as many good jobs and as many people employed as would be socially desirable. I think that's the basis for the push for economic development. That's why economic development programs on the whole, I mean, actually the public opinion polls are pretty consistent on this. Economic development is very popular with voters. I mean, at the time the Amazon headquarters 2 so-called project fell apart in New York State, a majority of the voters in New York State were in favor of the whole thing. I mean, you know, so we need to recognize that the job market is not a case where we can apply like some purist economic principles. We need to recognize there are huge spillover benefits. That doesn't mean we just throw money willy-nilly at it, but we need to think through the fact that there are benefits and there are costs, and how do we do this in an intelligent way. And by the way, the comment that James made about getting rid of this, the only way to really to limit this competition significantly, in my view, would be if the federal government adopted legislation similar to the European Union. The European Union, you know, all the states in Western Europe, and now with the UK dropping out of it, they regulate incentives. They have incentives. They have a rule of what they can be as a percent of payroll or of investment. The rate it can be varies with, is the local labor market economically distressed? So Berlin or Paris cannot offer very much in incentives. Bulgaria can offer tons of incentives, right? So that's one, and similarly within France or Germany, the former Eastern Germany can offer higher incentives than the rest of West Germany, okay? And they also have rules that their incentive regime does not apply to any kind of assistance programs to small business. They regulate more strictly for larger companies. And they also have exemption for customized training programs. You can spend the wazoo out on that. And they also allow high-tech programs. So I think we could, you know, at the federal level, if you ever be politically feasible, you should look at the European Union incentive regime. And when I've talked to people there, they have two rationales for it. One, preventing some of this cutthroat competition between, say, Germany and France for jobs. That's one of the things they're trying to avoid. Secondly, they're trying to avoid is anti-competitive effects of some of this. Because the reality is that the bigger companies are more footloose. And so if you think about it, the fact that we have incentives in the U.S. as a whole probably tends to increase market power of the largest companies in the U.S. But the reality is, when you're at the state level or at the local level, as Bob is, you know, this whole thing I'm outlining that in some ideal world, the federal government would regulate this, you know, I'm not holding my breath until that happens. Let's put it that way.
Gene?
Thank you very much, Gene Hardy, Assistant Professor at Michigan State University. In addition to like the EU regulations, then they just also announced that BYD, the big Chinese electric car manufacturer, they're actually probably going to be maybe even implementing tariffs because of the economic development incentives that the Chinese government is offering BYD to produce these electric vehicles at a much lower cost. So they're going to be likely implementing tariffs on them in European market, in the EU. For just building on what Tim was just talking about. So I had a question about sort of the role of sustainability in all of this. So water-intensive manufacturing and services seem to be like big benefactors of economic development incentives right now, whether that be through manufacturing, through data centers, et cetera, et cetera. Michigan, of course, has been mentioned multiple times, there's a lot of fresh water, but it's likely not limitless given climate change. In that maybe we shouldn't be giving away, you know, tons and tons of water to data centers, to cool servers who make it, you know, 2 cents cheaper to, you know, process a transaction fee on PayPal or something like that. How, from your perspective, how do you think that we should be thinking about balancing sustainability and economic development, both from an economic perspective, but then also, I think, probably for this audience, a policy perspective?
I mean, I really appreciate that question for sure. I think it's okay to say I've been directly, intimately involved with 3 significant chip makers over the last 3 years, very intense competition. All 3 we lost to other states. But the only reason I'm saying that is because I did learn a lot about electric and water usage of these kind of companies. I mean, it's absolutely off the chart, really, to be honest. And honestly, I'm very, very much an environmentalist. Global climate change is an existential threat. It's just important to me to say that out loud in groups like this, agree or disagree. So I take the issue of sustainability really seriously. I just think, again, kind of toward Tim, I'm so interested, you know, if we can find the right places and spaces, I don't think there need to be many, you know, mega sites, but in the right areas. I'd like to think that could be more around population centers, even population centers that need it. These companies are very adamant that they need to be near the university and a population center as well. But to your point, I mean, and again, I hate to say it, and I don't think this is just unique to Michigan, but I I know what our wastewater treatment capacity, it was laughable. It didn't even come close, and electric. And so I'm not sure what the answers are. I'm amazed at some of these chip makers. We thought water was a huge, and I think it is. But, TSMC is in Phoenix right now. Phoenix is building massive chip. I mean, where is the water? I don't know. Human nature. They think it'll just work out, I guess, or something like Florida. Yeah, they can't get insurance. 300,000 people moved there last year. I mean, it's just, you have to worry about human nature too. I think we are going to be a climate migrant destination over the next, sadly, I would say, over the next 30 years. And if I were me, I guess I am me, if I were us, we should be, I think, preparing and thinking about it now. To your point, though, is infrastructure. We don't want to damage a lot of farmland, though, and agricultural area. We've got to find the right balance and have a better community engagement and conversation between, all of us, urban and rural areas, about, I think, exactly the issue that you're talking about. We want to land those huge companies, and we want to be able to provide the infrastructure, but do it in an environmentally sound way in the right areas.
We'll take 2 more questions, one from this young lady and another from young lady.
I want to follow up on the Chinese reference. Never mind the competition between Lansing and Paducah, Kentucky. What about this big competition with another form of government in China that has a whole different way of thinking about, it's not democracy that's the point, it's prosperity that's the point. And so, don't we have to, we're going to have a fall of the Roman Empire study going on here at real time unless we cope with that competition of a different economic system. What is your comment about how we can cope with that?
Well, I think this is a key issue that goes well beyond the state, local, and incentives area. It really has to do with the industrial policy of the U.S. and the defense posture of the U.S. with our major rival China, which has much bigger population, has much bigger now manufacturing capacity than we do, including in many defense-related areas such as chips, such as producing drones, things like that. It's pretty clear that the U.S. over the next 20 years is going to be trying to figure out how do we revitalize our manufacturing base in ways that can support our national defense. There's going to be a significant industrial policy to do that. There's going to be some issues. The U.S. is probably too small on its own to do this. We're going to need to have some free trade with some of our allies and have them produce some of the manufacturing in order to match the Chinese size. And then in terms of economic developers like Bob, we're going to have to figure out how to fit into this. So what role, say, is the Lansing area and the assets of Michigan State going to be able to play in our existing manufacturing base in trying to rebuild the defense industrial base? Why did the U.S. play such an important role in World War II? It wasn't that we supplied the manpower to fight the war. We supplied the tanks, the bombs, the airplanes, et cetera, et cetera. We had this immense manufacturing base. But the reality is, right now, China has us significantly outgunned, maybe literally, in that area. If you want to read something really written about this, PhD economics, University of Michigan. Noah Smith used to write for Bloomberg, and he now writes a Substack blog, Noah Smith. And he's written a number of outstanding columns in his Substack blog about the U.S. competition with China. In fact, I think his comment today was on that. This is one of the issues he's focused on. It is a major, major national issue. We are not going to have a laissez-faire economic policy towards chips and towards defense manufacturing. We simply are not going to do it for national security reasons.
Somehow I hear former President Eisenhower's words ringing in my head about a military-industrial
complex. Well, but you need to have a military to win the war.
Yeah,
Chelsea Dowler with the Lansing EDC. I kind of know Bob's thoughts about this already, but I think one challenge to engaging the communities, especially in a rural area like Eagle Township, is that you look around Lansing and you see legacy pollution, legacy industrial sites that have sat and have not been cleaned up. We have sites that are polluting our neighborhoods right now. that we're just waiting for, a brownfield to come along so that we can clean them up. And so I'm just curious, where is the state's role in kind of, it's really hard to engage a community when you're leaving another community to just suffer. So I don't know if this is where the distress targeting or distressed communities targeting comes into play, or if this is separate. I just curious if you could all speak on that.
Okay, so if you want to help industrial cleanup in the state of Michigan, here's a couple of things you can do personally. One, don't take your cans back for the 10 cents, put them to your recycling center. Your recycling center can use the more valuable aluminum, and in addition, that 10 cents goes to environmental cleanup programs in the state of Michigan. Same thing with fueling up your car. We have an excise tax on fuel that goes to these purposes, and the state of Michigan has borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars for these purposes to take on environmental cleanup for abandoned sites around the country. Like, this is already part of the state's responsibility, and there are some things you can personally do to increase that. It's a known problem. I mean, that's something that is going to respond to political opinion. There's a long list of the DEQ or the EGLE. I call it EGLE unless they put agriculture in it. It's EGLE. But anyway, there's some sites that they do, and that's always going to be a triage problem, because there's you get an annual flow of resources, you put them to the highest, most beneficial use, and you keep making progress. And we've made a lot of progress on that, and we're going to continue to do that because industrial production is a much more heavily regulated process than it used to be before the 70s.
Yeah, I just really quickly, you're spot on, James, on especially that last comment. I mean, I definitely ran into that buzzsaw, those comments. You mentioned Eagle Township, not me, you said it. Nice people, good people out there. My kids went to school out there. But anyway, I think especially amongst young people, if I could say, I mean, I really understand. There's so much distrust, which is part of all of our problems right now between people and government too, for sure. That is very real, that needs to be managed. And it's because some lousy things happened. I mean, the only way I can answer that question, James made reference to it, is ironically, maybe to James or others, is that the government so poorly regulated the industrial environment most of the 20th century. I mean, that power station I mentioned across the street, oh yeah, that coal was sitting on the river, and there's a reason why they built the power plant on the river. You know why? To literally put the waste untreated straight into the river. I mean, that's why the industrial plants, mostly in Michigan, are built on lakes and rivers. Is because the lakes and rivers were literally the sewer system.
Or where we go in the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah, I would add that, if I could say with a touch of irony too, that it is economic incentives, particularly the Brownfield TIF program, which is a miracle, and especially for cities, is that sadly, most of these damnable companies that did that awful pollution go bankrupt and disappear. There is no one for the government to chase down and pay for it as they should. That would be ideal, but that's very rare. There is no one to chase. You can spend 20 years in court trying to force that, and you can't. The miracle that created by John Engler was the Brownfield TIF program. And this is where, okay, we can't find who did it, but at least we can pay back someone for a developer, a business, for making the extraordinary decision to build on a brownfield versus a greenfield. And yes, we will take the TIF and reimburse it. They don't get a tax break. They get reimbursed for all of their taxes that they pay over maybe 20 years or 25 years for the extraordinary cleanup costs that they have to unfairly endure. I mean, it is amazing that economic development is an amazing environmental impact program on the environment, more than any, I would argue, more than any, the actual regulatory agencies.
Just a quick comment. So I didn't stick that as a chart, but there are at least some studies, not as many or as rigorous as some of the other studies I referenced, that show that brownfield redevelopment has a cost per job created in the $30,000 to $40,000 per job range. So it's among the cheaper ways of creating jobs. And the reason for that is, I mean, if you want to generate economic development, you got to look at the factors of production. There's land. Do you have sites? There's labor. Do you have the workers with the right skills? Then there's capital. Do you have availability of financial capital? Of course, that's not as, a factor for the large companies, but for smaller companies, it's a bigger factor. And then on the margin, incentives can play a difference. But you have, again, we have a budget constraint. We need to make sure we have the land, labor, and capital available, and then on the margin, maybe the incentives can also make a difference.
Well, again, I want to thank these three for spending time with us this afternoon with their perspectives. I think it's a great example of how people can agree to disagree and have a very fruitful discussion and rich discussion. I want to thank all of you for being here. We'll have a recording of this on our website, ipser.msu.edu, as well as Tim's PowerPoint will be there within the next couple of days. Thanks for being here. We'll be back in September with our public policy forums. Have a great time.